All right, we've just gone 10 o'clock here on the 9th of September. We're going to kick off our latest CRA briefing for our premium clients, and also to those of you joining us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube who are not yet premium clients. We are sure you will sign up by the end of this discussion. So thank you very much for making time with us this morning. Today, we're going to talk about the current state of political violence in South Africa linked to the electoral decline of the ANC specifically, given that the party has been so important in South African politics and indeed South African society before 1994 and then later on into our democracy. When the party declines, when the patronage networks around the party declines, this places more pressure on society, on the economy, and of course to businesses and citizens just trying to make a living and improve their quality of life in South Africa. But we'll get into all of that shortly. Just a little bit of admin. The webinar is being recorded, so if you have to drop off for any reason, we'll try and forgive you, and we will also make available the recording afterwards, so no worries about that. If you have any questions, please place those in the discussion box on whichever platform you might be watching, and I'll get to those questions. I will give Ofentse and Hermann the most difficult questions and leave the easiest ones for myself. So please do throw those our way. And then also, please do stick with us for the whole discussion. Make sure that you give us thoughtful and useful feedback so that we can also push our analysis to the kind of level that makes it most useful for businesses operating in South Africa, navigating the risks and trying to take advantage of the opportunities. So, Hermann, before I start with you, I'll throw you the first question. I'm just going to set a bit of the scene here. Just this morning in Business Day, so as I mentioned, we're recording here on the 9th of September. This morning in Business Day, the CEO of 91, Hendrik du Toit, he did an interview with Business Day. He said that corruption and contract killings have become industries in South Africa. Of course, 91 manages about 3.3 trillion rand worth of assets. So if someone such as Mr. du Toit raises publicly, I think, his concerns about what is going on around corruption and contract killings and political violence, you should sit up and take notice. He goes on to say that when the legal establishment is fear-struck or corrupted, the rule of law collapses. Without the rule of law, commerce as we know it cannot operate. That means capital flight, job losses, and the risk of social instability. So, Hermann, of the Institute of Race Relations, I will start with you. Do you think Mr. du Toit, is he engaging in hyperbole? Is there something behind what he is highlighting and warning about here at this point in time in September of 2025 in South Africa?
Definitely not hyperbole. And the problem with the issue of political violence is that it really is a multifaceted problem that touches on so many parts of the current landscape in terms of the desperation of the ANC, their declining access to state patronage networks. We see the opportunism of the MK party. So especially in KwaZulu-Natal, where these parties are geared towards a fierce contest coming out of the 2024 elections, going into the 2026 or 2027 local government elections, we really have the stage set for an escalation of political violence through desperate ANC and perhaps an emboldened MK, and the links that have been entrenched over the last few decades in terms of access to a political underworld. And if we have to look at what can bubble up in terms of violence, I think we can look to the July 2021 escalations of violence, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, that had an overt political connection. I don't believe that those outbursts of violence were comprehensively planned, tactical, and strategic, but the instigation and critical node points were quite clearly politically aligned. The question of local government competence and local government patronage is one of particular note. Speaking to state officials and members of the government, something that is quite interesting is to, for example, note that National Treasury has been relatively immunized and immune from the type of politicization, commercialization, and opportunistic, grubby politics and corruption. And one of the reasons for it is that the National Treasury doesn't really have a procurement budget, unlike, human settlements or health. There isn't a procurement budget that can compare to other government departments as a lure for opportunistic patronage or criminalistic patronage hooks. Now, the opposite is almost true in terms of local government. Local government consists to a very large extent of procurement, of budgets, contracts. So it is a very on-the-ground state of contestation, especially if we consider water tanker mafia, something that has escalated as a crisis over the last 10 years. There's an incentive for water infrastructure not to be maintained or to be sometimes actively sabotaged, because you've got local politicians plugged into the system. Another system of local patronage, of course, is refuse and refuse removal. And the reason these two sectors, as it were, in terms of the local government setup, are so attractive to political criminality and the contestation of that criminal space through oftentimes violence, is that the entry level or the entry barriers to entry in terms of those sectors aren't complex. If you can afford a water tanking vehicle with the basic infrastructure of a tank and a dispersion mechanism, and you can find a source for water, you can enter the water tanker mafia business. And the same with refuse removal. If you can have a bakkie, a truck, or a trailer, you're there. You've got the necessary infrastructure and capital to participate in this sector. So those two and similar parts of local government are really vulnerable to the type of criminological capture that we are seeing, and that connects to political violence. We just have to think about, Jeff Wicks's recent book, which I haven't read, and I'm looking very much forward to reading, about Babita Deokaran. We think about the murders of Klute and Thomas Murray, and more recently, the murder of Bouwer van Niekerk. These are, I would qualify them as pseudo political murders, in the sense that they aren't overtly political as part of a patronage network, but they are linked to the protection of patronage networks that boil down to corruption, that boil down to the abuse of things like procurement processes. So there's a very, very direct link between the politics of how money is spent, how it is allocated, who gets to make those decisions, and the attractiveness of either competing for the ability to exercise that discretion or to compete for the benefit of that discretion. And what is, I think, especially non-hyperbolical about what the CEO of 91 is saying is the fact that we are a country where we can have municipalities like what's it, Norma? I can't exactly remember, that had 19 political assassinations with, Nongoma, sorry, not Nongoma, Nongoma, that experienced 19 councillor killings in 12 months. I think it was the year 2023-24. So what you see in that isn't a desperation for public service. It is a desperation for access to patronage. And that is an inevitable consequence about how procurement especially has been set up in the country. So if you've got the core components of corruption, and you've got a panicking political class or an emboldened political class, then you've got the perfect mix for political contestation to turn deadly.
Ofentse, I can see you're itching to jump in. I'm just going to stick with Hermann just on this point, because I want to focus in here. Hermann, just on the importance of getting the policy space and just the basic governance space, right? Where we've had this rise, I think, not even the last 5 years, longer, and possibly into the future as well, given the fiscal and skills and service delivery shortcomings and issues of local governments across the country. We've had this emergence, not yet of clear enclaves, but former director of the CRA, Frans Cronje, his scenarios for South Africa into the 2030s, one of the scenarios in the set was the sort of enclave society, where those who really can afford private security, water, everything else, they sort of go, they build high walls and they recede into their enclaves and they take care of what they need to in their immediacy. But if you don't get the wider policy space, the governance space right, I mean, those circles become smaller and smaller. I don't want to discount those. I don't want to underestimate the work that many people do to try and protect themselves, their families, provide for themselves. I mean, we've seen not only in affluent areas, you've seen in many so-called township areas, people try and save money just to put in a sort of boom kind of thing, or get private security because they can't rely on the police, for example. They try and build some kind of just of their own system of managing sort of flow of people in their areas or on their homes. Just talk to us a little bit about the importance of that, because I guess you can keep on pulling back from society, but if you don't influence things as a business, as citizens, if you don't influence things on the local government and policy space, your circle, it's going to keep on sort of getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and for the country, I guess.
And one of the problems with the enclave scenario is that it allows a route for some socioeconomic survival for a relatively wealthy part of your consumer class, as long as they are connected to a services economy that could be digitized, made remote, exported through online channels. But if you are in, for example, the construction industry or the mining industry, if you are any industry that requires going, as it were, beyond the boundaries of the enclave to participate economically, then you run into the risks at work that you might be avoiding at home. So the enclave society works for services and a remote-based economy. Now, that economy could boom. One of the points that I think South Africa has going for it is that our time zone positioning is significant, that our service economy and our skills base for things like IT, accounting, these things can service a clientele stretching the entirety of Africa. And essentially, our business day coincides enough with every business day from Tel Aviv to Reykjavik. So there is scope for the enclave economy to really specialize and lean into that direction. But because of just the state of the South African economy, that is, I would say, at most a third of the formal economy that can develop in that direction. The rest does need agriculture, transport, manufacturing, getting goods and labor to and from markets. You can't get away from that. And to that extent, the enclave society has some real confrontations with the outside world that it needs to deal with. And in that dealing with the links, perhaps, of roads and transport between enclaves and between places of work for the part of the economy that isn't in the services sector, that can be, as it were, the working from home economy over the stretch of Africa, you will run into the political patronage systems, the corruption systems, the sector mafias that are currently confronting South Africa in a more universal and holistic way. So I do think the enclaves are an important part of the development, but to most businesses, we are not in that position. We can have an enclave society based on a professional class of labor, but I do not see a feasible route for businesses en masse to say, oh, great, let's just move to the enclaves, because your labor won't necessarily be there to start with. And as we saw with the cities under apartheid was in a real sense an enclave society. And that is what led to your townships attracting to your city centers. So the enclaves physically will become walled city centers and will attract to them the sort of economic desperation that drove rural Black South Africans towards the cities, towards the industries in the cities. So you're just moving the hubs from being city sectoral and industrial to perhaps being supporting economies around nodes of relative prosperity. But you will see townships and informal settlements appearing closer and closer to these nodes, even if the consumer economy is relegated to the enclave section of society. So I don't think it is a free pass beyond the political machinations, the patronage networks, especially not as long as the South African economy remains structured in the way that it is. And I don't see that changing for the next 2 or 3 decades fundamentally enough to neutralize that problem of enclaves, yet still attached to the rest of South Africa.
On that point around the economy, Ofentse, I'm going to bring you in here. We've been doing quite a few briefings in the last 2-3 weeks for international audiences, international clients. Last month, I was in Washington, D.C., where I met with Congress representatives, businesses on the U.S. side. And so often in the conversations in our briefings, both domestically and internationally, the sentiment is, why aren't you guys fixing things in South Africa? We want to come and invest. We want to know what's going on. We're keen to deploy our capital. And this is in the global context in 2025, where there's more uncertainty. I'm not saying it's going to be concretely settled in over the long term, but there's uncertainty around the dollar, around US assets, around US markets, given trade and other policies emanating from the White House. Investors are looking at emerging markets even more so than before. They're betting on possibly lower interest rates, somewhat lower inflation, and then they think, look, let's deploy our capital in places in emerging markets where we haven't before. Many of those emerging markets have got a handle on their debt situation. They're sending the right kind of fiscal responsibility signals. But what are you guys in South Africa doing? Why do you continue to have this high endemic rate of crime? What do you think, Ofentse, in terms of those conversations that we've had in the last 2 or 3 weeks? And now it's being crystallized, I think, this issue, this plague that South Africa has of crime and political related violence that really undermines our investment case in a very serious sense. Very lastly, before I hand to you, the meeting that President Ramaphosa and his colleagues had in the White House with President Trump a few months ago, when the myth, the issue of white genocide came up, South Africa's defense isn't, no, there's no white genocide. The defense is there's no white genocide. There's just record high killings of South Africans across the board. And that was from representatives of South Africa in the White House. That's not the kind of signal you should be sending in 2025, I think.
Yeah, that's true. We shouldn't be sending a signal like that. I do appreciate the honesty from them, though, that we do have a crime issue. And sticking to that point, from the conversations we've had, we have asked some of our clients international as well, what is an issue that you look at? And a big one that they mentioned, sticking on this topic of crime, is crime. So looking at the Global Organized Crime Index from 2023, South Africa ranks 7th in the world as having this epidemic of global crime, 3rd in Africa and 1st in Southern Africa, scoring a criminality score of 7.18, 10 being high crime, 1 being low crime. So the data supports the fact that there is a crime issue, and it's broad, it's widespread, and it's affecting investors. However, investors do still invest in South Africa. There is an attraction that South Africa is offering, despite the lack of reforms. If the government would actually implement these reforms rather than focusing only on maintaining infrastructure, but also real reforms that open up the gates to markets, we would see an exponential attraction of investment. A reason why I believe that there is still an attraction for investment is because of our resilience to organized crime. So our resilience to organized crime, according to the Global Organized Crime Index, isn't the highest. we actually rank 50th globally. This is out of 193 countries, but we do rank first in Southern Africa. So in the region, we are still, our institutions that protect us, Chapter 9 institutions and our courts and so on, they still do enough work to not scare off all our investors. However, of the metrics of the resilience score, the two metrics that South Africa struggles on is law enforcement and victim and witness support. So that goes to all the sentiments that's been shared by CEO of 91, especially the issue with Babita Deokaran. There's people who are trying to do their jobs, law enforcement and whistleblowers, but there isn't enough support from the state to protect these people. And a sign of patronage networks play a big role in this issue. Going as well back to the allegations made by Commissioner Nkwanazi. This all connects all the dots, and essentially there is a path forward. It's just that it needs to be done on a policy level. Once the GNU starts to offer what it's promised, starts to deliver on its promises, then there will be far more investment than what we're receiving so far, despite our investment attraction still being slightly positive. But until then, because after the past 14, 15 months of the GNU, stagnant growth, still high unemployment, and no policy reform at all. So there still isn't a sign to be optimistic yet, but there's still a sign to not be completely pessimistic.
I think you're exactly right to hit on the resilience point. South Africans have been forced to be so resilient, but businesses in South Africa shouldn't have had to do that for the last 15, 20 years if the policy choices had been, the policy and ideological choices had been the pro-growth, pro-liberty ones, I think. Hermann, I'm going to come to you next, and just a reminder to everyone, thank you very much for making time with us this morning. If you have any questions, discussion points for us, please do pop those in the discussion box on the respective platform where you are watching. Hermann, yesterday President Ramaphosa said he agreed with the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that institutional reform is necessary to root out corruption that has flourished in public institutions. So this was in his latest weekly newsletter, where the president doesn't really take press conferences and questions. He talks to the nation through his newsletter that we can all then discuss afterwards. Ramaphosa, the president, highlighted tax evasion, market manipulation, inflated contracts, and tender collusion by business as all causing significant harm to the economy, but they receive less attention than corruption within the state. Hermann, what I've mentioned there, anything else in the president's latest newsletter that you might want to pick up on, especially on the reform side, where we can ascribe many adjectives to President Ramaphosa. We can talk about consultative and wanting to talk to every stakeholder possible in society. Perhaps the best embodiment of this has been the national dialogue. So sort of talking things to death versus actually taking action. What was your impression, and what do you take from this in terms of the possibility of reform going forward?
What struck me, two things struck me about the president's missive is number one, the special pleading, that we do see this idea of the president taking the line that they took to the White House, almost, we're not just failing white South Africans, we're failing all South Africans, was sort of the defense they offered. And his government on corruption is now sort of taking the point, no, it's not just corruption that's failing, it's business as well. So it is not honesty about policy. It is not honesty about the causes of failure. You can see that this is political blame management. He is trying, like with the white genocide mythology, trying not to dispute the fundamental failure facts. He is trying to reframe as to where the finger should point for blame. Because of course there's corruption in the private sector, but the private sector ought to be policed by the national law enforcement structures. So if he is bemoaning illegalities in the private sector, he is bemoaning the failures of his own government. But ideologically, it is necessary for the ANC to say the private sector isn't the solution, because more and more South Africans are becoming frustrated with state failures. So this is political theatrics in terms of trying to manage where the blame falls, not disputing the fundamental issues at stake. So that's the first thing that stood out for me from the missive. And it is perhaps pointing out that the experience that South Africa has had with, for example, Steinhoff is an indication of overt illegal activities within the private sector. But the last time I looked, the consequences for Steinhoff have been severe. I mean, Marcus Jooste himself ended his life by his own hand. The company has not recovered. Its relationship with its remaining creditors have been fraught, and it is in sort of an irrevocable decline. Forensic investigations have materialized, prosecutions have been initiated. So what differentiates the collapse of something like Steinhoff in terms of its value for money offering is that its consequences were forced by the market. People lost confidence in the business and withdrew from the business, triggering the collapse that we've seen over the last few years. That sort of remedial response does not apply to government procurement processes. If a government procures as shoddily as Steinhoff cooked their books, or if government cook the books to the same extent that Marcus Jooste cooked his, you don't get the market pressures that ultimately forced some sort of consequence on the company. Whether it's perfect, whether it is exhaustive, whether we are satisfied with it, that's a different question. But you can't deny that there were consequences, where the consequences on the side of the public sector and governmental and statal failures to add value for money are not met with the same sort of systemic remedial responses that are connected to shareholder confidence and the marks of a public company versus a private one, or a public entity versus a private one. So that's the first part. I think it's ideological special pleading, because the president is worried that the private sector is making his government look bad. Now, that is not remarkable, because it's not very difficult. 85% of jobs in South Africa are private sector jobs. So, I mean, let's President Ramaphosa can try to shift blame, but I don't think anyone will buy it. The second thing that I found interesting is the NACAC advisory direction that there should be a renewed or an overarching anti-corruption public integrity entity. Now, that is all good and well. If it ends up being a Scorpions 2.0, I'm sure there will be a welcoming of it by many sectors of society. The extent to which the Scorpions have been romanticized as sort of, had it not been for that decision for the Glenister cases, had it not been for that, corruption would not have been able to fester and eradicate business confidence in the investment case for South Africa. I think that's a comforting and a simplistic fable that we tell ourselves. And yet I regret the Scorpions being scrapped. So I would welcome the creation of a similar entity with investigatory and prosecutorial competence. However, if you look historically and globally at what drives corruption, you can find 4 common elements. Number one, overtaxation, in the sense that people simply keep less of what they earn than ought to be, I think, a feasible case. There's more money flowing towards the state than the state has the capacity to responsibly and transparently manage. That's point number one. Point number 2 is the spending side of that revenue, is that there's overspending, there's a largesse in terms of spending, and there isn't much of a focus on value for money. Thirdly, you have broad discretionary decision-making at various levels, whether it is the allocation of a tender, a contract, an appointment, or the issuing of a license, the approval of construction rights, the whole system of setting up gross fixed capital in South Africa is infected by a raft of discretionary networks that are politically controlled. Now, the fourth component is weak oversight. And it's on the fourth component of corruption that NECAC's recommendation might be part of the solution. But unless we address overtaxation, a state taking too much revenue than it can feasibly manage, number two, a state spending too much than it can transparently manage, and a state that sees its spending and the allocation of resources and permission funneled through patronage networks and systems where officials have wide discretion, we won't actually eradicate corruption. That is, if we look at the examples of Estonia and Georgia between 2003 and 2012, in the case of Georgia, it was on the side of bureaucratic change and lessening the activities of the state, lessening the number of decisions that could be made by state officials, that corruption actually became or turned from advancing to being in retreat. In 1998, South Africa ranked 32nd on the Global Transparency Index on corruption, and Estonia ranked 26th, relatively sort of within touching distance of each other. Now, Estonia between 10th and 15th in the world, we have fallen, I think, to 76th in the world. Over the same period, the one country addressed the supply side, as it were, of corruption, and the other one paid lip service to the managerial side, but only a quarter of the problem. And Mitchell, Bithke, and Zukov, in their remarkable book about Estonia's journey from Soviet vassal state to one of the most successful countries in Europe, they have this quote that I just think sums up corruption and the stand against corruption and the criminality that links it to political violence and patronage. They put it so simply: with government officials having less say over who could buy and who could sell, government officials were less likely to be bought and sold. Georgia in 2003 had an immensely complex licensing regime that their traffic police, famously corrupt, managed. Over 900 separate licenses were managed by this police force. Of course, with each license comes a bureaucratic system, and with a bureaucratic system, the opportunities for the face-to-face corruption deals, the bribes, the lubricant of cash. And what they did was they cut the number of licenses to 150. They restructured the police. They had a smaller police force, but more merit-based appointments with higher salaries. In Hong Kong, the same thing happened. In Singapore, the same thing happened, where the police was restructured to disincentivize corruption. So if we are serious about corruption, then it isn't just about making sure we put more rat traps or better rat traps for when the rats creep up on us, is making sure that the rot attracting the rats in the first place is dealt with. And that's the reforms that President Ramaphosa in his missive clearly does not have in mind.
And of course, most, if not all of those reforms would attack and break up vested interests, where again, we've seen over time this building up of patronage networks around the ANC. I think this goes a long way to helping us understand why we haven't seen the kind of resourcing of the NPA, for example, or when cases do proceed, they're either built so flimsily, and that's resource and other skills issues on the part of the NPA, but also when you've got ministries, the Justice Department, when files get lost. It's just the incentive is there to protect vested interests around the ANC wherever possible. And it's not just to target the specific party. I think most other parties, not all, but most in that kind of position with that kind of influence and that incentive, this kind of thing would have happened. Now, Hermann, I'll throw it to you now, just to mention how for President Ramaphosa especially, the hope that South Africans and big business in South Africa placed in him and individuals for reform and for accountability, when the policies and the ideology in our governance space haven't changed. So there was little reason to think that we would see the kind of accountability that we should have had. Hermann.
And what is problematic for the ANC is that they fall into the same ideological trap as the National Party. They have a state-centric socio-economic worldview. President Ramaphosa in 2019 in Parliament, asked by Mr. Ndlozi of the EFF at the time whether he shares the belief that the state should be at the center of South Africa's economy, and President Ramaphosa very clearly, very firmly endorsed that position. This was during the era of Ramaphosa. So what the ANC struggles with is that as long as you have a state-centric socioeconomic philosophy, you will incentivize the collection of rot that attracts the rats of corruption. What the Estonian example and the Georgian example, and even in the 1980s, the New Zealand example shows, is that the supply side addressing of corruption is where the most change can happen, where if you privatize entities that are currently not vulnerable to market forces for accountability, either partly or entirely privatize them, you will see the pressure forces of value for money creeping into the institutional cultures. We talk about institutional culture a lot when we talk about corruption, but the motivators for what pressures could incentivize these changes are quite often made shallow and not truly addressed, because the ideological blinkers of the South African state is that it should be in a commanding position. And even the idea of a new unit to fight corruption is another centralization where market forces would quite deal more brutally and more simply with the situation. And last point, sorry for hogging the time. What is fascinating also about what Estonia did is they simplified the corporate tax system and the private tax system, which meant that there were fewer discretionary nodes in the process of actually filing your taxes, of making sure that you and the Revenue Service are on the same page. Complexity breeds discretion, breeds opportunism, breeds corruption, breeds criminality. And there's no coincidence that we see escalations of political violence at very particular points in the political calendar. When candidate lists are being debated and discussed, we see an escalation of these killings and the violence. When procurement processes, usually towards the end of the year, start ramping up. So you cannot ignore the linkages between centralization of resources and decision-making through complex processes and the ultimate result of political violence.
Ofentse, I'm going to come to you next, just on broader sort of political dynamics, and Hermann, please also feel free to jump in here after Ofentse, but just around the ANC's prospects. So in our last few risk alerts, the last 2 or 3 weeks, so our risk alerts that are sent to clients every Monday morning, we've highlighted various challenges really rearing up for the ANC in terms of basic branch membership, especially in the Eastern Cape, which is one of the most important provinces for the ANC going into next year's local government elections and the 2027 ANC National Conference. But also we've seen polling, and the most recent of which conducted by the Democratic Alliance, which has the ANC's fortunes, electoral fortunes, rapidly declining. So this idea, our colleague Dr. John Endres, CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, has highlighted in Business Day over the last week, this idea that, first the sort of electoral decline happens slowly and then suddenly for the ANC, where it's been coming for many years, but maybe it'll fall really off a cliff now. Ofentse, any thoughts on the DA polling itself, maybe the sort of sentiment that the ANC really is on this inexorable path of decline, possibly around 20% nationally in the next local government elections? And I'm not going to ask you to go into the methodology and critique or praise that of the DA poll specifically, but just your reading of things. Do you think it is plausible that the ANC could be tracking that low?
Indeed, I do think so. When looking at the current trend, so obviously the ANC is on a decline from its peak in 2004 at 70% to 40% last year. There is another trend that we can see when comparing national and local government elections. So whenever there's a national election, the following local government election nationally, the ANC gets a lower voter share. So in 2014, the ANC got 62, and then the following local government, it got 53. In 2019, the national election, it got 57. And then the following 2021 local government election nationally, it got 45. So with last year's national election, the ANC gaining only 40%, following the trend, it's safe to predict that it will get below 40%. How far it will fall down, we are not completely sure of that yet. The DA's polling, and yes, not to get too into its methodology, an important point I believe is important to make is that in its methodology, it doesn't consider a realistic voter turnout. So it makes the numbers from 100% voter turnout. There's no community anywhere in the world where 100% of its population will turn out to vote. A lower voter turnout, however, mostly it hurts the ANC the most out of all parties. Mostly it's because those that don't vote anymore are disgruntled ANC supporters who do not find an alternative in the political market. Who that helps the most, however, is the DA, because it's the second largest party. Fall from the largest party helps the second coming party. So the DA's polls, although it's still early days and it's just a snapshot of the current mood and it's not meant to be used to predict elections. It could be analyzed in that the ANC actually has it far worse than what the polls are showing. There was a report that an ANC poll had the ANC at 12% in Johannesburg. So the picture for the ANC does look a bit grim for its coming elections and its lack of reform. What we've been talking about this whole time, it's doubling down of its current policies of mostly the National Democratic Revolution ideal that it's trying to implement. Those very policies are what's hurting the ANC, and it's not introspective. It doesn't want to change for the better. Rather, it believes in doubling down to try get more votes, and realistically, that's not happening. We also see that in recent by-elections where the ANC is losing quite a lot of by-elections, although it is still winning some by-elections. Maybe we could say it's 50-50. A loss of 50% losing track record in by-elections for the ANC. This was unheard of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So there is a change that's happening. There is a decline. And I believe the ANC, those inside the party, they do know it. And they do believe in these polls that come out. They have to show face. They have to critique the polls. They have to critique the methodology, who the polls are from. But they do believe what's going on. They just don't have the will to be proactive and try to limit and minimize the threat that's at hand.
Hermann, just on that very good point, I think there from Ofentse, the sort of introspection, the possibility thereof or not for the ANC. So it's difficult. I mean, yeah, if I were in an NEC meeting and you see your party polling as low as it is, you are, or you see yourself as this liberation movement, not just as a political party. And then you ask, well, why, could it be me? Am I the problem? And I do draw the contrast here. I covered this in a piece in Business Day yesterday, where unfortunately I apologize to myself and everyone else for bringing this up, but the rugby on the weekend and the Springboks going down to the All Blacks, what lessons do they take from the loss versus what South Africa tends to do, and South Africa in the form of the ANC and the government over the last 15, 20 years, where it's always, you might introspect on the issues, but then you find something else to blame. So it's the global financial crisis. It's the downturn of a commodity cycle. It's COVID-19. There's always something external. Now it's tariffs from the US. Tariffs didn't cause South Africa's manufacturing decline, but it's now a useful target again to blame. So just give us, Hermann, your thoughts on any possibility of introspection in the right kind of sense within the ANC. And if you were in an NEC meeting, how would you package, this kind of feedback so that it does land in some way where you might have the possibility, the chance to give the ANC a different way to tackle its problems, depending on how you can sort of sell it, as it were?
Yes. So South African political parties have a remarkable ability to learn the wrong lessons from political and electoral outcomes. The ANC had its, as referred earlier by Ofentse, its most remarkable election campaign in 2004. And it was a remarkable election campaign by many, many metrics. But the one that stands out to me most is how we should remember that this was a party of 10 years incumbency at the time, led by a politician who didn't have an enormous political following, personal following, Mr. Mbeki. He wasn't a well-loved figure. He wasn't as popular as Mandela. He wasn't as in touch with ordinary people as his successor, Mr. Zuma. So after 10 years, with no personal political momentum behind him, Mr. Mbeki's ANC grew their vote share. Now, I'm not quite sure of any other political party in a democracy spending a decade in power and gaining a vote share from 36% to 70%. That is genuinely remarkable. It is remarkable by any political standard. It goes against the rules of political gravity. And what is astonishing about that is that the ANC seems unwilling or unable to investigate why they achieved that. Now, the South African economy has always been a passenger economy, in the sense that, yes, tariffs will hurt us, COVID will hurt us. But the South African economy of the late 1990s, the early and mid 2000s, was an economy, passenger, yes, but at least it could float on the Asian commodity boom at the time. There have been booms since 2009 that we have missed. No one should pretend that Mbeki economy was this robust, world-leading economy. It was just perhaps a buoyant economy, but a buoyant economy is still better than a sinking economy. So yes, external forces have beaten us down, but external upward tides have not lifted us to the same extent that the Asian commodity situation allowed the South African economy 25 years ago to gain the benefit. So instead of a buoyant economy, we have a dogmatic economy. Instead of a liberalizing economy, we have a centralizing economy. And those things translate simply into the attractiveness of a country for business and for capital, for revenue, and the ability to spend it. If one of the great legendary graphs in IRR and CRA history is an imposition of ANC support overlaid with the rollout of services like housing, electricity, water, and GDP growth and performance. And they form a beautiful correlation. When the ANC was on the right side of trends in terms of service delivery and economic bread and butter issues, they got the benefit of the doubt in an historic way. The next, I think, most significant political moment in South Africa happened 20 years later, not necessarily the election, the VAT debate. The VAT debate earlier this year should be studied every day by every political party in this country to understand what is it that can move the board and the pieces on it as we stand. The DA went from having between 4 and 5% of support from Black South Africans to 18% on IRR polling at the time. The ANC collapsed from 40% to below 30%, and the DA rose from its 22% roughly at the election time to just above 30% on the back of more than tripling the support it received from black voters. Now, why I say political parties in South Africa have a remarkable ability to learn the wrong lessons is that the DA hopefully learns this time around that there is no such thing as pandering politics that black South Africans will take seriously from the DA. The DA, for better or worse, whether true or not, has the reputation of a middle class party, primarily based on minority support. If you are going to try and microwave, as Samadola Fikeni says, if you're going to try and microwave young black leaders into positions of prominence and think that that will be credible to black voters in South Africa, you are underestimating the extent to which the DA's reputation has been formed since 1994 DP and then 1999 DP and then DA. So the problem for the DA has ever been that it is so easily seen as pandering to black voters, and it doesn't work. And yet, when there was the purest, simplest bread and butter issue of higher or lower sales taxes, the DA tripled its support from black voters. And the ANC saw an almost perfect transference of its support to the DA. And it revealed the simmering notion that between 22 and 25% of ANC voters have the DA as their second party to vote for, were the ANC not an option. What the EFF and MK should also note is that they were the other two notable parties opposed to raising taxes on this bread and butter issue. You had three government parties that got the call overtly wrong, and three parliamentary parties, one government party, that got the call right. The PA, the IFP, and the ANC, on the back of the VAT debate, where they supported raising VAT, lost support. Despite being in the GNU, the DA gained support, MK gained support, the EFF gained support. So if you want a breakthrough, if you are the DA or MK or EFF, your breakthrough lies not in whether you can out ANC the ANC. It is whether you can understand that the ANC has become the party of broken promises. It is distrusted. It is not seen as the party of action. And it has this vulnerability of increasing out of touchness. If I were in an NEC meeting, that is what I would say to the ANC. You won 70% of the vote when you had a buoyant economy. Look back at what caused that buoyancy. You lost 10% in a post-election year, 10 percentage points of your vote, when you went against the fundamental idea that people don't want to pay more taxes so that you can afford the patronage networks and the public sector wage bill to keep your tripartite alliance together. That would be my advice, is you have these track records of extreme success and extreme failure. What's remarkable is that the ANC seems allergic to what once drove them to a 7 out of 10 voter loyalty.
Yes, indeed. I think that summarizes it very well. We're coming up to the hour, so I'm going to give us one more discussion point, and then we will head off. Ofentse, to you, any sort of thoughts around the next year and a half? We've got the local government elections, we've got the ANC conference coming up in 2027, and we will see, I think, increased jockeying and competition there. I think Deputy President Paul Mashatile very much got the inside track, despite all the corruption allegations in the media and elsewhere. He's got the history in the party. I don't know yet if there's anyone strong enough to really challenge him, but you'll see contestation still. Many things can happen at an ANC conference when inevitably, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that money will exchange hands. So I'm not going to rule out anyone else coming in to compete against him. But just your thoughts over sort of the next year with those political points in consideration, and also the international pressure that, in our view, will continue from the US. Quite a bit of the feedback that I received in Washington is that how Washington under Trump 2.0 has dealt or tried to deal with the ANC specifically, that is not going to change anytime soon through things like possible targeted sanctions and other areas of pressure on South Africa around the G20. We've just had the news that Vice President J.D. Vance will come and attend the summit instead of President Trump. If the South African government thinks it's going to be an easier ride with Vice President Vance, I've got some magic beans to sell them. Ofentse, over to you.
Sure. Just to begin with the local government election next year, possibly early 2027. In Johannesburg, the DA is well positioned to become the biggest party in Johannesburg. It has the benefit of being in opposition. And speaking of the bread and butter issues that Hermann was talking about earlier, there are people in Johannesburg who could go days, whether you're in the most affluent urban area or in a township, you can go days without electricity and days without water. When you're sitting in the dark and your taps are dry, you're not thinking about the hue of someone's skin. You're thinking about your real life issues. So when it comes to voting, and if Helen Zille is the mayoral candidate, a lot of voters, black voters included, won't shy away from voting for the DA away from whatever party they were or traditionally supporting. So this could the damning election results that the ANC could get in the local government election will play a big role into the ANC conference when it enters into that. There will be a lot of finger pointing because the three metros here in Gauteng are under Lusufi. His faction could take a lot of blame. However, with Ramaphosa being the president, his own faction as well could take the blame. In terms of the running of the ANC presidency, the only person that could have challenged Paul Mashatile was Senzo Mchunu. So after these allegations made against him, we're not sure yet if he would still run. He still can, technically, but whether his reputation has been damaged and that's now just a dream, we'll have to wait and see. However, as it stands, polling just before the election, and I'm sure it's still the same now, the Cyril Ramaphosa polls higher than the ANC itself. He is the most popular politician in South Africa. And even with him at the helm, the ANC dropped from 57 to 40%. So at this point, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't for the ANC. It doesn't matter who takes over from him. That person won't be more popular than the current president and won't be more popular than the ANC itself. So whoever they get in after Cyril Ramaphosa, they won't be able to recover any of their votes. And at this point, a decline is inevitable for the ANC. In terms of external pressure, so the pressures, especially from the US, is not going to damage the ANC electorally. There isn't an appetite for foreign policy amongst voters. It's not going to play a role in especially local government election. However, with the coming or with the looming or whether it happens or not, targeted sanctions on ANC leaders, the ANC could use that to sell itself to its voters. We've been targeted. They'll play the victim card, and everyone likes a victim. Everyone likes an underdog. They can play that card to their voters who would buy that, and could also attract some radicals from either the EFF or MK who prefer a side-in with China over the US. The US, with these targeted sanctions, would give the ANC an excuse to be like, hey, these guys don't like us. They're actually not the people we should be with. We're going to try and move over to China and Russia and so on. This can attract voters who support that ideal. So that attack from the US administration on ANC officials, if the ANC play their cards right, they could use it to their own advantage. But overall, the external pressures won't affect the ANC as much, or as it should rather, because there are going to be some economic consequences from the tariffs, from targeted sanctions, and maybe from even worse sanctions. Hopefully that never happen in a worst case scenario. And yeah.
I think to add there as well, Ofentse, is that external pressure, who uses it within the ANC, who uses it against people like President Ramaphosa and Fikile Mbalula to say, look, you guys have put us in this position. The GNU isn't working. It sort of adds more maybe to those within the ANC who are saying the party is going in the wrong direction. So we'll see if that plays out or not. Hermann, I'll give you the final word on any sort of outlook for the next year, and also just in terms of any high-level thoughts for businesses navigating, I guess, this environment of increased political competition that unfortunately manifests in increased political violence, which we don't see going away anytime soon.
Yes. So I think the DA's polling is generally quite believable and trustworthy. So their numbers are quite likely right. But there are two other indicators of the state of political play that can assist at this stage. Number one, fundraising. Number two, by-elections. Ofentse has touched on by-elections, and I would recommend anyone to read Davhie Boonza's analysis of a few weeks ago, looking at by-elections since the elections last year, showing, I think, the ANC doing worse in 60% of them and the DA doing better in 60% of them. Of course, the PA still being very much a source of worry for the DA. So if you want to know what the political trajectory is that we are on, I would look at fundraising reporting, by-elections, and opinion polling. Those three things would give you a direction of travel, if not necessarily a snapshot or a prediction. Then secondly, this is likely to be the high watermark for the DA, in the sense that some of the mayoral candidates and strategists I've spoken to in the party believe that it won't necessarily get better from here, that this is probably as good as it gets before the election campaign proper starts. So the DA shouldn't count any chickens, and I don't think it is counting its chickens. One can see that perhaps that's the reason why Helen Zille sort of poured cold water on the polling being so stupendously negative for the ANC and positive for the DA. So there's still an uphill battle. The ANC might be dying, but it's not yet dead. And then perhaps finally, sort of overarching, what my advice to businesses would be, understand that the ANC is in an irrecoverable decline. You cannot, as a business, invest political soft power in relationships with only the ANC anymore, for the reason that it is unlikely to have positive ROI. Your influence will not escalate if you have closeness with the ANC, because the ANC itself will decline in political relevance and importance. You've got 10 political parties sitting around the cabinet table. That means you now have 10 times the channels of access to ensuring that a point you care about might reach cabinet level discussions. Don't waste that opportunity. Don't waste that potential. Ensure that, as the CRA always advises, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Make sure that if you want policy level discussions to reach cabinet, you have strategies to work with. The ANC, the DA, IFP, Patriotic Alliance, Freedom Front Plus, the UDM, Good, Al-Jamaa, Rise Mzansi. Make sure that you do not put all your eggs in one basket in terms of influence. And then on top of that, we all know local government is the level at which service delivery and most businesses see the immediate consequences of government policy. Do not sit out the local government elections. Get out there, invite mayoral candidates from parties to engage with you, understand what they are offering. You've got so much of a voice at this moment in terms of the influence you could have. Our politics, especially at a local government level in all metros, is liquid, febrile, competitive. That is beneficial to making sure that you can influence, have a positive influence in terms of things like labor market rigidity, ensuring service delivery of the nature and the kind that you and your labor and your products and your supply chains depend on. Do not waste the opportunity of intense political competition, either through the GNU with its multi-channel cabinet or the local government elections, as parties are now in the process of setting up their prospectus for that ballot contest. It's a remarkable opportunity that has never been as clear, as promising in the history of South Africa. Don't waste it.
I think that is an excellent note on which to end. So thank you very much, Hermann, both to you and Ofentse for your time and your insights this morning. To all of you who made time with the CRA this morning, thank you very much once again. If you are not yet a CRA client, we invite you to become a client today. You can find more information at the link below. Our domestic politics, our international politics is shifting more than arguably at any point in the last few decades. Your business needs the data and the analysis to manage the risks and to take advantage of the opportunities that are guaranteed to emerge. So trust the CRA to be your partner in that journey, both in South Africa, in the region, and globally. On behalf of Hermann, Pretorius, Ofentse, Davhie, I'm Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. We'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.